lounging, son.
All right, welcome back to the Comic Lounge. My name is Ryan, and with me today I have a very special guest, a legend. Brian Bolland is here to chat some comics with me. I am so stoked that I can finally get you on the show, man.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I mean, like obviously probably like a lot of people, my first introduction to your work was The Killing Joke. And as a little kid, like I loved Batman. Batman was one of my favorite characters, and that story just blew me away. It was like one of my favorites, still is one of my favorites to this day.
Great.
So I'm really stoked to be able to pick your brain a little bit. I love always kind of finding out, how creators, like they grew up in a different generation than me, whether they're younger, they're older, how they got into comics, like what started your love. I mean, you grew up not in the States, so I know that I've heard the experience is a little bit different in terms of the comics that you guys had back then. So what was your first experience?
Well, we had a lot of comics in this country going all the way back to 1914, really, with Rainbow. But and we've had a lot of funny comics. I think that's kind of a disparaging word in some ways, but Beano and Dandy and things of that sort were the things that a lot of people in my country grew up with, but I didn't. I liked the sort of more realistic sort of adventure kind of stuff. But Dell Comics, because I started buying American comics in 1961. I was 10 at the time. And I bought a Dell comic called Dinosaurus. I'm sure you've read about this. And I cannot remember the name of the artist who did the cover. The inside artist was called Jesse Marsh, and it was based on a film. Jim Danforth was one of the stop motion animation film makers like Ray Harryhausen. And it was a sort of rather crude dinosaur film, and they made a Dell comic out of it. And that really appealed to me. This was before Marvel really came along, the modern incarnation of Marvel, which was 1963, I think.
Right.
And superheroes weren't really the dominant meme really in comics. There were giant creatures and there were dinosaurs and that sort of thing. And I started with things like Turok, which was Turok, Son of Stone. Mm-hmm. I cannot remember the name of the art. Maybe you could fill me in with the names of some of these artists. So I had quite a collection of Dell and DC comics from that sort of period. And, okay, well, the story is that in 1959, it may have been a company called Thorpe and Porter started shipping American publications comics in the ballasts of ships in 1959, because they had to sit at a certain level in the water. I think it's called the Plimsoll line or something like that. So they had to stuff the holds of these ships full of these comics. And that started in 1959. So we got a regular supply monthly of various American comic brands, DC, Dell in particular. Mm-hmm. And that's what got me started. I grew to absolutely love some of the artists of the time. Gil Kane was my favorite. Some of the others too, and that started me off as a collector.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, I think I read, like you said, like Carmine Infantino, Kurt Swan were a couple of them too, right? That were influential on you. So what I find, for me, it's fascinating, the fact that like if you go back and read the comics from then, there's no credits for the most part.
No,
so it's like.
No.
So like, growing up, like I started reading in the early 90s, like there was credits, I mean, I don't think they really they didn't put them on the cover, and then eventually they did. And then they eventually put the colorists on the cover, which they also didn't do up until like maybe 10, 15 years ago. But how do you follow? How did you figure out who these names were? Did you not find out till later?
That is such a good question. I had a very good friend of the same age as me, he was a couple of years older than me. And the two of us, I think we kind of stimulated our mutual interest in this stuff. And between the two of us, we knew the names of all the artists. We knew Mike Zakowski, we knew Carmine Infantino, Murphy Anderson. Bruno Premiani was a great favorite of mine. He drew Doom Patrol from about 1966 onwards. Yeah. And then, but also you go back to sort of artists like Bernard Bailey, who because I bought a lot of the DC mystery comics, House of Mystery, House of Secrets, Tales of the Unexpected, what others were there? And they had a whole range of artists, one of whom occasionally was Jack Kirby, although he didn't particularly stand out at the time. But you could instantly tell, is that a Jack Kirby or is that a Ruben Moreira? Yes, we knew it. But how we knew it, I really couldn't say. I'm going to have to do the research. But, you know, I mean, show me one of these artists and you know, Lee Elias or somebody like that, or Bill Ely or Jim Mooney, all of those artists, even though they were not credited, we knew which was which.
Yeah, I think it's just it's such a crazy thing to think about, because like, I mean, everything else, like they had credits, but they just nothing. Like there's no, and I rarely when I've gone back to read it, you don't always even see the artist sign their little signature and everything. Like I always try to look for it. I mean, I can tell Infantino at least, because like I love his Flash stuff. Like Flash was always one of my favorite characters.
He's so distinctive, and he's such an elegant artist, Infantino.
Yeah.
I had a complete collection of Flash going all the way back to Showcase #4, which was 1956 or something like that.
Yeah.
Which they say is the sort of rebirth of, it's the birth of the Silver Age, really. It's the rebirth of the superhero as the dominant meme in comics. It came from Showcase #4, which was, I think that was drawn by Carmine Infantino and inked by Joe Kubert.
Yeah, I know. I love
the very first Flash.
Yeah, I love that comic. I have obviously I don't have the original, but I have the reprint of that myself.
I had the original.
Jealous. So when do you decide, like, obviously, like, you're reading comics and you become a fan of them, you and your, like you said, you and your friends would, like, between the two, you guys figure out the artists, who they are, and you start following them. When do you decide that you want to be a professional cartoonist yourself?
Well, I think as a junior school kid, I don't know what your term for that would be, but I think one of my strengths was drawing. I hadn't particularly decided what I want. I mean, I love dinosaurs, so I was always drawing dinosaurs. But what was your specific question again?
Oh, like what kind of prompted you to decide to make a career out of it?
Yes, good. Well, because the sort of dominant artistic form that I was exposed to was these comics, it was quite natural to want to see if I could do them. And Gil Kane was my first, mentor. I mean, I didn't meet him until many, many years later, but I was trying to draw like Gil Kane. And my friend Dave Harwood, and I'd started producing these versions of this sort of stuff, drawn in by a ballpoint pen and crayon. So it naturally became this sort of stuff that we drew from 11, 12, 13 years of age.
And when do you get your first comic gig? Like,
well, I mean, we spent quite a few years doing fanzine. I mean, we did our own one-off sort of folded paper, one-off thing. I mean, I did loads and loads of pages of a thing called the Insect League. I had my own version of the Justice League, and each of the characters was like an insect person. So there's pages and pages of that, but it was a long, and the early stuff only ended up in fanzines. We didn't get paid for it. I don't know whether that counts as a gig, but I mean, my first ever paid work was not actually a comic thing at all. It was a spot illustration in a, Time Out magazine, don't you? Have you heard of Time Out?
It sounds familiar. I'm not completely familiar with it, but I feel like I've heard that.
Okay,
before.
well, in London there was a whole lot of underground periodicals. There were things like Oz, and it was back in the sort of underground comic period when you'd have people like Robert Crumb and a lot of that influencing the underground stuff. And one of the underground magazines was called Time Out, and it was in London. And it incorporated a lot of film reviews and music reviews and also listings of what was on TV. And in 1972, I did a little spot illustration for them, not in a comic book style, but of a jazz bassist called Buddy Guy, I think. And that was my first paid ever piece of work. £5 I got for it. But my first professional comics work was this thing. Dave Gibbons and I did alternate issues of a thing called Power Man, which was a sort of African superhero. That was from 1975 onwards, 75 to 77.
And so is that a kind of like, did that start like a lifelong friendship kind of with Dave? Because that's, I mean, that's
Yes.
quite a bit.
Well, I think Dave and I got to know each other because the fan world began to know each other, because, you know, we would have our work published in these fanzines. So a little clique of people, including Dave and me, and Dave Harwood, who was my local friend, and some of the others. We knew each other to some extent, even if it wasn't in person. And I think we finally met at a comic convention in 1972 in London. A lot of the people who then went on to be artists or writers or publishers or bookshop owners all met at this 1972 convention in London. Also, Terry Gilliam, of the, you know, the film director. Terry
I do know
Gilliam,
too. Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, that's awesome.
great film director.
Do you still have any of those that early work, those early fanzines?
Oh yeah, I've got my very earliest work. It's all still here. I mean, it's not fit for publication, but it's all here.
Oh man, I'd love to
Yeah.
take a peek at that. I love seeing, because I love watching the progression of artists, and like as they become better, as they figure stuff out, you know, like you can see that growth. It's something that I've always really dug looking at. You eventually work on the Judge Dredd stuff. I first heard about Judge Dredd like as a kid, like with the movie. I didn't know about the comics. I didn't realize till later that there was comics. I've kind of read bits and pieces. I'm kind of sad to say that it's never something that I've ever really jumped into full force. How did that gig with like 2000 AD come about?
Well, Dave and I, with our Power Man work, it was all done through an agent that we both had together, and it was called Bolland Press Features, and Bolland is short for Barcelona and London. He had a lot of contacts with Spanish. There were a lot of Spanish artists working in British comics in Fleetway.
Oh, interesting.
Was the publisher over here, and so the publishers use people like Bolland to access artists for their weekly comics that we had over here. We had all sorts of comics going all the way back. And I'm sure there are all sorts of intricate reasons why IPC did. Well, it was 1977, you see, and I think Star Wars came along, and I think IPC Fleetway, I'm not sure quite what it was called at the time, but they hadn't had a successful science fiction comic for a long time. And I think it's my theory that since Star Wars just came along, they thought maybe we should try a sci-fi comic. And 2008 was a long way in the future, and they thought, let's call it that. Yeah. Carlos Esquerra, who was a Spanish artist, was also with Bolland Press Features, and the guy running Bolland was called Barry Coker, and Barry got together a group of artists, Carlos, Dave, me, to have fill the pages of this new 2000 AD in 1977. I didn't join for a while because I was still required to do a few more issues of Power Man. Dave and Carlos, I think, were in 2000 AD. They call them progs, you know, program 1. I think they were in right from the very start, but I didn't join until number 11. But it was a weekly in black and white on really tatty paper, really shit paper. Have you ever seen the originals?
I haven't seen the originals, no.
Because eventually we reprinted some of the Judge Dredd stories in the Americas as American editions. My friend Nick Landor, who was also one of the people from that convention that we met in '72, I think, he was by then running Forbidden Planet, and of course I'll have to just plug that. And also doing a bit of beginning to do some publishing and as Titan Books, and they repackaged the Judge Dredd stories that we'd drawn for the American, but with added color for the American market. So there's some rather nice editions of Judge Dredd in the American comic book format with color, which you may have seen. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I've like I said, over my long time of reading, I've bits and pieces, but I've never actually gotten like this like in order. So I'll definitely have to track those Titan
Yeah,
books down, because they put out some really nice collections.
they have done. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
After you're talking 77, so 79 and in kind of 1980, they call the British invasion of
Yes.
a lot of creators like yourself coming over and doing a lot of work with, like, especially like DC.
Yes.
What, like, but do you I'm kind of curious, because like you guys already have established careers, you guys are already doing comics, but at that
Yeah.
time, was it looked at like doing stuff for the companies in the States? Is that what it meant to kind of like be more recognized, if that makes sense? I don't know how to, I'm probably wording it very wrong. But you know what I mean? Like, was that kind of the goal, I guess, for some of you guys?
Well,
Like, you wanted to work on those characters.
well, I was a fan of DC. I had been since I was 10.
Hmm.
So it was purely by accident that I got a cover assignment on a Green Lantern in 1979. So it was such a thrill.
Yeah.
I mean, I still love Judge Dredd. I think he's one of my favorite characters that I've ever drawn. But the sort of 10-year-old that was still in me was so delighted to be drawing Green Lantern and those characters. Um, Now, the thing is, it was, you see, back in the earlier 70s, there were a lot of Filipinos working in American comics. Alex Nino, Nestor Redondo, people like that. And I assumed that they were still living in Manila or somewhere working away, but apparently they all migrated to the States, to your part of the world. In fact, I think Alex Nino, I think, is living in Los Angeles, isn't he? Do you know who he is?
I know him. Yeah,
Yeah,
I didn't know
yeah,
he lived in Los Angeles, but
yeah.
yeah.
But so they were actually local artists, even though they were Filipino. But I think the idea of artists from across the other side of the Atlantic Ocean working, there were sort of practical problems getting the stuff across the Atlantic. And around about the time we didn't have the means of communicating, we didn't have emails or any of that sort of stuff.
Right.
So it was quite a novel idea that somebody as far away as this country, where I am in England, could. We had a fax machine, and for the first time, we were able to telephone images to each other. So it became a possibility for foreigners like me to work in American comics.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's during that period, like early 80s, I've gone back and read a lot of that stuff, and it's some of my favorite stuff. Like, I know you did you worked on Justice League 200, I think, right? I have
I
that
did, didn't
comic.
I? Yeah.
That's one of your first interiors
Yeah.
for DC, or maybe
Yes. Oh, I did a few little things in House of Mystery.
okay.
I, what was it called? A few short stories in some of the mystery books. What was the thing you just mentioned, by the way? Oh, it was that's right. It
Justice
was
League.
the number 200, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
And yeah, and so I started actually traveling over to New York to visit DC Comics, which was a terrific thrill because all these people whose names I, come to know, like Joe Orlando and Ross Andrew and Mike Esposito and Carmine and all those people were suddenly my mates. We could sit in an office together and talk about stuff. And so that was really. And Julius Schwartz was the veteran editor at DC.
Yes.
He'd been responsible for all the mystery books going back through the 50s, Strange Adventures and some of those things. And he took a liking to me, I think, and Dave Gibbons, who also went over. I think he liked the way we spoke. He liked our funny accents. In fact, I remember we were out on the street once, and he took me by the arm because he knew that the traffic were coming from a different direction to what I was used to. And, he was worried I might get run over. But he was a lovely man, and he just said, "Look, just come up with some Superman cover ideas, and Justice League cover ideas, and I'll send us the roughs, and we'll okay them, and you do them." And so I ended up doing a number of Superman and Justice League covers just on spec. One of which had Starro the Conqueror on it,
Mhm.
who was a great character who ended up in a film recently.
And the
He was in
Suicide Squad.
Suicide Squad too, wasn't he?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Now
That's I,
somebody told me that that very soon they left DC and joined Marvel because the Marvel stuff was kind of more gritty, and the DC stuff was just silly. Now I've always loved the kind of silliness and the sort of peculiarity of things like Starro,
yeah.
and so I've always enjoyed that kind of oddball stuff that they were doing.
Yeah, I've always kind of like because I grew up more of a DC kid than Marvel. I mean, I liked Marvel, but
Yeah.
I loved DC.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So like, because my first comic was a Flash comic.
Really?
It was what was when Wally West was Flash. It was during the Mark Waid and Mike Wieringo run.
Right.
And so from there, it's like that's just kind of what I got. And then Spider-Man, obviously, eventually, because there was cartoons and stuff. So I got that. But yeah, DC was always my first love. And I've as I got older, like you said, some of the funnier stuff, the oddball stuff, but I've always equated that with the fact that they have a longer history than Marvel. Because Marvel wasn't around when all, like some of like the weirder type of stories were happening at DC, like in the 50s, and the 40s, and then kind of bled over. And then, writers start to pull from the past of what they loved as a kid. And I feel like that's always what you see. You always see like the newer generation of creators pulling from what they loved when they were a kid. Like you see, I'm like, for me, I'm seeing it now at DC, like not in a bad way, but like the stories that I grew up reading as a kid, the writers are around my age, so they're pulling from some of those stories, and I feel like that's kind of, and I don't know, I've always loved the legacy aspect of DC that you don't really get
Oh, really?
with the Marvel characters, like the generational aspect, I guess, is what I was trying to say too.
Well, I mean, Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman, they've been around so long. I mean, they'd be in their 80s or 90s by now, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
But yeah, oh, that's interesting. I really imagine, because I have to admit that I'm not very familiar with Marvel. I bought some Spider-Mans with Ditko. I liked Steve Ditko's work.
Yeah.
And I met him briefly once, which is quite a rare thing because he became quite a
recluse,
recluse, really, didn't he?
Yeah.
And I loved Doctor Strange and Howard the Duck. I really got into Howard the Duck.
I liked Howard the Duck.
I found in many cases that a lot of the Marvel characters were sort of Marvel versions of the DC characters. So DC had Aquaman and Marvel had Namor. So they were both sort of swimming, fishy people.
Right.
They both seem to have a kind of Hawkeye and Green Arrow. They both seem to have. So Marvel seemed to have come along with their versions of very similar characters.
I feel like the only one they didn't really do that with was like Superman. They didn't really have their own Superman. I think Batman.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like Batman, you could, I guess, is like Daredevil, Captain Marvel mixed together, or Captain America mixed together. I've always kind of felt like they separated. They pulled a little bit from each one. But yeah, I don't know. I love DC. I've always loved DC. I have my periods where I'm like, maybe I'm not reading as much, but I always end up going back. It's like comfort food to me. It's like comfort comics, those characters,
Wow, it sounds like we've got a little DC appreciation society going on here.
Yeah. I mean, I have my whole left arm is tattooed, and it's all DC.
I always tend to stare at people with tattoos. They must think I'm weird. I'm just kind of staring because sometimes I see my own drawings on people's bodies.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, I have Hal Jordan. I have Joker. I have.
Now, who's Joker? Whose Joker is that?
That's Greg. It's Greg Capullo.
Oh,
it's the one where he. I let my artist kind of do what he wanted to do. I didn't tell him a specific Joker. I just said do whatever, and that's the Joker he picked. And then I have Green Arrow, Black Canary, and Flash on my arm.
Wow, you really are a DC man. You're tattooed with this stuff.
Yeah. So going forward, let's talk more about your stuff. So you did a book called Camelot 3000, which I didn't read until later in my reading career. I guess I don't know how else to word that, but it's rare, like, because you're known mostly for covers, but I love getting your interiors. Like, so Camelot 3000 was a delight. What about that book kind of drew you to that? How did that pairing with Mike W. Barr come about? Because I've always loved King Arthur, the King Arthur lore, so it's a really cool spin on it.
Well, because DC was so welcoming, having made these first contacts, you know, I was looking for regular work, so they just, who would it be? I think Len Wein was the editor, and I think he must have just, I don't know who was really behind it, but they pitched this idea. I don't know whether Mike Barr pitched it to them first, but they offered me this maxi series, and of course it turned out that it was the first prestige maxi series as a direct sales book, wasn't it? I think there had been some direct sales individual issues. I think Marvel did one, but I wasn't particularly enthusiastic about the material, actually, because I didn't know anything. I think they thought King Arthur, that's English. Let's get Bolland, he's English. He'll know all about that stuff. But I didn't. I had to actually read about it. But it was a fantastic regular assignment. It was it was 300 pages eventually, I think, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it was regular work for the company I loved. And Fleetway or IPC, whatever they're called at the time, the people that published 2000 AD, they had only reluctantly allowed credit boxes on the artwork so that the readers could tell who the writers and artists were, thanks to Kevin O'Neill, the late Kevin O'Neill, who worked there at the time. But they didn't treat us very well. They didn't return our artwork, and they didn't make any kind of a fuss about us. The people who actually drew the stuff were the lowest rung of the ladder. But going over to DC and doing this new project for them, DC were quite interested in promoting it, and suddenly they were shipping us around the world to conventions to do interviews, and suddenly you felt like a bit of a pop star, you know. Mm-hmm. And I remember getting on the cover of, what was that magazine? Mike Barr and I were on the cover of, I forgot the name of it. But they made us feel rather special in a way that our local companies hadn't. So I've forgotten whether that answers your question or not, but it was a different experience from what we'd had before. It was very nice.
It upsets me when I hear like how you guys didn't get your artwork back. Every time I hear that story, because I mean, obviously it goes back for decades. I mean, I've heard the stories of like Jack Kirby trying to get his artwork back and it being like,
there are stories like that.
Yeah, left in the hallway and people were just like pillaging it. I don't know if that's true or not. It's a story that I've heard. I kind of want to just real quick ask you about that. So when did you start receiving your artwork back? Like DC, for example, like were you getting your artwork back at that point?
Oh, DC always returned artwork. But back in those days, I had really no idea. Okay, I've got to go back a bit because, I mean, stop me if you've heard this story, but IPC Fleetway kept all the artwork in a place they called the Vaults. And there were terrible stories about how they had a flood there one day and they were using some of Frank Bellamy's beautiful full painted artwork to mop up the flood. They sort of laid it on the floor to walk on or something. But they had the idea that if they returned the artwork to the artist would then take that artwork, maybe change it a little bit and sell it to somebody else, which of course is ludicrous. Yeah, you couldn't possibly do that. Eventually the vault became so stuffed full of this artwork that they thought, well, why don't we return it to the artists? Well, there's a crazy idea for you. So they required the artists to catalogue every page of what we'd done so they could find it, because they didn't know who we were. And I think I listed about 300 or so pages of Judge Dredd and 2000 AD artwork that I wanted back, only to discover that people had got in there before me and gone off with over 100, I think 115 some pages to sell somewhere else. But anyway, as soon as I was working at DC, they were quite happy that it was policy to return the artwork in each case. But I had no idea of the value of artwork. There was a period when my friend Scott Dunby, I asked him to go to DC and collect all of my artwork to save them sending it back to me and sell it. And so a lot of it was sold at comparatively cheaply by today's standards, I would imagine.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's insane. I hear stories of creators, fellow creators, right, that as they were young fans before they became comic book artists, right, like what they were getting pages from like George Perez for, and I'm just like, I was blown away. I'm like, I mean, I couldn't even believe it. I mean, like $50-$100 for a page. I'm like, that's unheard of. You couldn't get any page for $50 or $100 from any artist now, even like an indie guy.
Oh no,
so
I know.
Yeah, I think that it's like the value of the art. I think it's so gratifying. Even though I don't make art, it's so gratifying to see like the acknowledgement of comic book artists, and like watching the values of their work go up over time and seeing how much these pages sell for now. I mean, it's insane. If you look at heritage auctions and you watch like a John Byrne page, or you see a Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, like all these artists, like the older stuff, like George Perez's art obviously has gone up. I'm sure Neil Adams, all these things, all the artists that have passed away, Kevin O'Neill, all this stuff just continues to go up in value, and it's pretty cool to see.
It's a funny thing. Only today I was asked to write a little tribute to Kevin O'Neill, who died about a week ago.
Yeah.
And Kevin, first and foremost, was my friend, and we all knew each other. And once a month, Dave Gibbons, Kevin O'Neill, Mick McMahon, and one or two others, I'm sure Alan Moore was there occasionally, would go and have a pint and a pizza together in Soho in London, and we were mates, And it's really great to see, now that Kevin's died, how much they appreciated his work, because it was so strange, unlike anything.
Yeah.
God, it was weird. In fact, I think he did some early work for DC Comics in the early 80s. He did a Green Lantern, and somebody in the company took one look at it and said, "This guy must never be allowed to work here again, because it's just so weird."
I love it.
Yeah, lovely stuff.
Yeah, I know he's somebody that like I wish I would have tried harder to kind of get on the show, and talk to, because it's, you never know, like you never. I hate like thinking that way, but you never know what tomorrow will bring, So like I may be sometimes. I'll be honest. Sometimes like I may be annoying to creators. Like if I like I'll keep like reaching out until I get a flat no. I keep doing it, because it's not like I'm not doing it for any other reason than I love and appreciate their work, and I just like, and sometimes you don't get to talk to them or meet them in person, so this is the closest I can get. And
well, when we finish with this, you'll have to tell me who you've had on.
Oh, for sure.
I'm sure your viewers don't need to be told.
I've had quite.
You don't need to list them, just for me in private.
Okay.
And you can send me links too, and
definitely.
Thing I find with a lot of comic book people who get interviewed is they get asked a question and their answer lasts about 15 minutes, and I think, my God, how can you have that much to say? I
mean, personally, I appreciate that. So
I mean, some people are fascinating, aren't they? But I think in many cases, when you ask most people, how did you get into comics? It's because when they were 10 or 11, they bought a comic.
Yeah.
And they just went on from there. And so a lot of the stories are very similar.
See, but I always ask, because sometimes I get answers that I wouldn't expect, like the Dell comics, like I don't think I've talk to anybody that was one of their first things that they got into, you know, and that kind of stuff. So
Okay.
it's always cool to hear. And sometimes I've asked questions and I get like a 1 sentence answer, and then I'm like, oh, like what how do I feed off that? How do I continue the interview like when it's such an abrupt answer and it's done? So like, yes, sometimes,
Yeah.
you know, like I can ramble on too, but I kind of like when the conversation goes that way, because it feels more like two people just hanging out and talking, you
Well, I
know.
suppose it's a lot better than these awkward silences. You know, you ask a
Yeah.
question and the answer is like one word or two words.
Yeah. So I want to I want to come back full circle to where, you know, kind of what I was talking about in the beginning with Batman the Killing Joke. I'd love to hear kind of how that project with Alan came about. It's one of the most, in my opinion, one of the most influential Batman stories ever with the character. It's one of the most
Yeah.
beloved stories with the character. So I'd really love to hear how you.
Well, I mean, just prior to that, I mean, Frank Miller had reinvented a Batman comic in the form of Dark Knight, hadn't he?
Right.
He'd done it again with that beautiful Year One with David
Oh, David
Mazzucchelli
Message.
and
Yeah, so good.
Richmond Lewis. So I was a bit of a latecomer, really. In fact, weirdly, um, I before I quite early on with it, I was in New York, and Frank Miller and I knew each other a little bit. They used to come and visit in London, and I met Frank and Lynn Varley in a Japanese restaurant in New York, and I said, "Look, Frank, I'm doing a Batman graphic novel," and he said, "Well, don't you think there've been too many of those already?" I think he thought it wasn't really a good idea to do yet another Batman thing, but it was already in production, so
Mhm.
we went ahead and did it. But it's in there. It fits in there as one of those '80s things, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
Good.
Uh, um, what I wanted to ask too, like, I mean, people have always asked, and you know, that final page, how it's left
Oh,
very ambiguous. Was that your decision or was that Alan's decision?
well, I think possibly I ought not to answer that because
Okay.
people are
All
still
right.
debating.
Fair enough.
No, no, I will. But it may be a disappointment to you. But nowhere in Alan's script was there any word of it being an ambiguous ending. Um, I think the fact that they were kind of silhouetted against the backlighting of the police headlights, it meant that, yeah, I mean, Grant Morrison has come up with a lot of very complex theories about what goes on at the very end. Does Batman kill the Joker in that last scene? But if there is a conspiracy, if there is an ambiguity there, then I'm just as much in the dark about it as you are.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Yeah. Fair enough. Fair enough. I do. You know what? I also I think I read this correctly. I hope I'm not getting this wrong, but eventually when I think the deluxe edition comes out or a later edition, you recolored it, correct?
Yeah, I did.
How important was that for you to be able to recolor it and kind of completely get your vision out? Because I know that the palette back then, like the technology wasn't there, so you were able to do a lot more with the newer technology.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, I spent a long time drawing the line work for Killing Joke because there was no urgency. Nobody at DC was saying, come on, get it done," because uh, I think it had gone off their radar for quite a long time. But then eventually, when it was near completion, they then had a date, and it had to be coloured, and that was the technique was called blue line,
Mhm.
and that would have been quite a lot of work in the short time. And I John Higgins had recently done all the colouring in Watchmen. So we all agreed, let's get John to do it. So I sent John the pages of, well, maybe a page and a half of notes about the colours. Because I'd really loved Richmond Lewis's colours in Batman Year One over Mazzucchelli.
Yes.
I love that sort of muted browns, but also in the flashback scenes in The Killing Joke, I really wanted it to look like Eraserhead or something. I wanted it to be in monochrome, and I had this idea that little details that you only caught from the corner in the corner of your eye might be in color. So I had all these notes that I sent to John, and then I waited to see what how it would turn out. And eventually, Nick Landor's Titan Books had their own edition of it, I think, didn't they? And I was waiting and waiting to see how it looked, and I got a call from Titan Books to say, yeah, we've got some copies here now, but I hadn't got any yet. So I said, well, how do they look? How's the color? I said, and somebody at Titan said, well, it's kind of garish. And I said, garish? So eventually I got a copy, and it was so not the way I'd envisaged it.
Mhm.
I couldn't work out why everything was purple and orange. And the flashback monochrome scenes seemed to be all done in orange.
Mhm.
And I didn't like it at all. I hated it. I got quite depressed about it. So when 20 years later, when they were doing the deluxe edition, I said, can I recolor it? Because now I have work on a computer, and I now have the technology to do the coloring myself. So I actually colored it the way I saw it. And I mean, it's a bit unfortunate for John in a way, because when the issue came out, he didn't know that he wasn't going to be in it, that the coloring had been redone by me. And you still get people who quite debate quite heatedly about which version they prefer. Many people prefer the original coloring because that's the issue they bought at that particular time of their life.
Yeah.
And it's their prerogative, really. So both exist now.
Yeah, I mean, I understand both arguments. You know, I understand liking it the way it originally came out. I kind of, I mean, I equate it more with like Star Wars when George Lucas redid Star Wars. Like, I wish I could just have the original versions that I watched as a kid before he did the
Yeah.
special edition. But in terms of like comics, though, to me it's different because it's not. It's like you as the artist getting to see your vision done, and
Yeah.
like that's how you intended it to be done. And I think that that's like there's room for both. You know, I like both each like in its own right, but I loved getting to see you redo the colors, and I think um it definitely hit different. You know, reading it that way.
And of course, if you can afford it, you can get the absolute edition. So you get both in the same book. Also,
Yeah.
you get Alan's script in there, which takes up more space than both of the so-called graphic novels.
Yeah. Yeah. How let's yeah, the script for that. How detailed was that script? How much room did he kind of, you know, does he let you kind of do your thing?
Well, I mean, the thing about Alan is that he's very thorough. You know, I think he thinks visually very. I have worked on scripts in other years where the writer really hasn't really seen it. You know, he hasn't seen that you can't go from that moment to that moment without another moment in between. But
Mhm.
Alan was so thorough in visualizing. I mean, he'd just done Watchmen, which came with that very rigid 9-panel format. And he was still, and I was, you know, I thought that was a great way of doing it. So I used the same sort of format a lot of the time in Killing Joke. But he was very thorough in telling me what was in all those pictures. I don't think I did an awful lot of adding stuff that Alan hadn't asked for. And
Okay.
it made it very easy that he'd got a very clear picture of what it should look like.
So I want to talk like the majority of your work that I've seen is cover work, right? So I mean you to me are like the pinnacle of cover artists. Like you do
Oh,
some of the most iconic covers. Like I think you did a series on Batman Gotham Knights in the early 2000s
yeah,
that
yes, I did.
I love
Yes,
those.
yeah.
And I think that so like I whenever I think of Batman, I think of your version of Batman, and same with Joker. Like those are the first images that pop in my head. And I was wondering, like, how do you approach sequential storytelling, like when you're doing that, as opposed to coming up with like one image? Like,
Well,
how do
I
you?
don't do it. I don't do a lot of sequential work. I mean, I've got my own sequential thing, which I do, which is called The Actress and the Bishop. Have you seen that
I haven't seen
at
that.
all?
No.
Ah, well, that's the latest thing that's in print of mine. I've had these two characters since the 80s, called The Actress and the Bishop. It's a sort of a kind of a joke in a way. Like it's gone back ages. If somebody says, "Oh, you've got a big one there, say,
Yeah.
as the actress said to the bishop, you know.
Yeah.
It's a kind of blue joke. And I once drew a one-off print for a French portfolio, and it had this raven-haired sort of woman, glamorous woman, with this decrepit old bishop. And I was once asked to do a 3-page story for an anthology in this country called A1. And I thought, oh, those two characters could be interesting. Let's explore who they are. And they've been around ever since. And I've only recently published a 14-page story in a magazine here, a comic magazine here called Shift. Called Shift, yes. And they're collecting the whole back catalogue of The Actress and the Bishop in one edition, which is coming out this month. Well, December, I think. But it's all done in rhyming 4-line rhymes, and it's all done in a rigid box-like shape. So my approach to I don't really do a lot of sequential art that's written by other people, because I find that they don't see it the way Alan saw it. They're not visualizing and controlling and understanding the visual aspect of the stuff the way he does. So I don't do an awful lot of it. So I'm not really an expert, but I mean, I do cover work because I'm very slow. And after The Killing Joke, I got a lot of work offers, and they said, "Can you draw this?" And I said, "Oh, I couldn't possibly. That would take forever." And they said, "Well, can you just do the cover then?" And it just became a kind of habit.
Yeah.
And I do love the fact that, you know, I work on an image for like a week, and then I can send it off and not think about it again, and then the next week I'll be drawing a completely different character. I mean, I do like it when there's a bit of a story element in the cover, but I'm afraid nowadays it's often give us an action shot, so it's like sort of Superman or Batman looking, kind of like that. And I used to enjoy, back in the early DC days, where the cover itself had the story going on. You could tell what was going on in the story. That was a rambling answer to your question.
No, I mean, that's what I was talking about. You know, like I love. I don't like when it's just the action shot. I don't know. I think that, like you just said, it's missing in comics now. It's nothing. That doesn't pull me in. You know,
No.
like as much as like the covers from back in the day used to, like you would see like Flash or whatever, he's hanging from a roof, he's lost his speed or something like that, you know.
Yeah.
Or
yes, well, I mean, all of those Flash cover, Carmine Infantino, I mean, I've been looking at them recently because I go on a thing called Silver Edge Comic, a group or something on Facebook, and so we've been comparing a lot of those, the first 60 or so Flash comics, and they all have a very clear idea of what's going on. You know, the trickster is up to some nefarious activity or other, or Flash and Kid Flash are going into the future and into the past. So you can tell that there's a story going on there. But now, I mean, I've just recently done 9 actually Batman covers in a series. I've got one here actually, things like that.
yes.
And it's, each one featured a separate villain, and so I just did portraits of each of the villains. You know, Penguin, Two-Face, Mr. Freeze, and because I've no idea what's going on in the story, so a lot of the Batman covers I drew didn't actually have Batman on them, which was always fun.
So, I mean, like when you're approaching a cover, I mean, you just said for those particular ones, I know that those One Bad Day series, it's all basically doing their version of Killing Joke, right?
Really?
Yeah.
I'm afraid to say I haven't read any.
Yeah, so it's basically like it's because that's basically what, I mean, Killing Joke is like, he had one bad day and then his
Yes,
life went to
actually, I
shit.
can tell. I thought the idea would come from there. I mean, this is the
I love
first
that
one.
cover.
And the artwork on the inside is very, very nice. It's very photoreal.
Yeah, so each one is a different artist too, a different creative team, which I think is kind of interesting. And I think it's great that they brought you in to do a cover for each one, you know, considering
my covers look very traditional compared to this rather nice photoreal stuff. I don't know whether it's coming across very well, but who is this guy?
That's Mitch Gerards.
Mitch Gerards.
Yeah.
Ah, yeah.
He did.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did a book. He did Heroes in Crisis. No, not Heroes in Crisis. He did one issue of that. He did Mr. Miracle with Tom King, who also wrote that book you just had.
Really?
Yeah, really good book.
I can't imagine Mr. Miracle not done by Jack Kirby.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. But it is a really, I mean, I think it got nominated for Eisners and stuff. I think it won a couple Eisners actually.
Oh, really?
Because it overlapped 2 different years, and so it won for both.
Yeah.
Really good book, definitely worth picking up.
Oh.
But in terms of like when you are coming up with a cover, besides doing like just straight with the character, when you do get the story, how important is it for you to incorporate it into your cover?
Well, I would like the cover I draw to have something. I did this one on a, I don't know whether it's picking up to on a.
Oh, the Swamp Thing.
I love drawing Swamp Thing. Is it getting a bit too glare? It's in a plastic wrap.
Yeah.
But I got an impression from the inside that he was having some sort of struggle with technology or something, and so I suddenly came up with the idea of spending ages and ages drawing sort of machinery. There it is.
Love it.
That took ages. I mean, the great thing about Swamp Thing is that you can cover him in kind of fungus, and you can improvise. So yeah, yes, I sort of say to them, "What do you want on the cover?" And they give me some idea of what's going on inside. Not always a very thorough one, but I think in the past I've had all kinds of instructions. I mean, I did the covers on The Invisibles, which was fantastic fun, very experimental period for me.
Yeah.
And whether I was getting the full script or not, I think I was. But I mean, the covers have to have something to do with the interior story, even though I wasn't drawing it. But sometimes I get instructions directly from somebody like Grant Morrison about what he wants on there, and sometimes from the editor Shelley Bond.
I love Shelley.
She's great, isn't she?
Yeah, she's awesome. Yeah, I met her when she was doing a Kickstarter a few years ago, and I've developed a friendship with her. I've helped go pick up her Kickstarter books from like Long Beach and stuff, and deliver them to her and Philip.
She lives near you now, doesn't she?
She lives in Burbank.
Yeah. Well, the last Zoom I did was with Grant Morrison, Frank Quitely, Philip Bond, and her, and me.
Yeah, for the reunion videos she did.
Yes, I've not seen them since.
I haven't either. She hasn't released them yet, I don't think. I know it was for everybody that backed her project on Kickstarter. I was like, oh man, if I could be I would have loved to have like just been like watching you guys talk, because everybody in that Zoom I want to have on my channel eventually. So like Shelley's been on the channel like 3 or 4 times, I think I've had her on. She's always been. She was great.
She was really great as I mean, I've done a lot of covers for her for various things. I can't remember which, but she was always very. You'd send the stuff in, and you'd always have to go FedEx or something. So the physical artwork would have to go. No, it wouldn't. No, of course. What am I saying? It was. Well, it would actually, because during my period on the Invisibles covers, I gradually switched from artwork in full color on board to artwork that was partially done in Photoshop and sent on, online, and to eventually doing the whole thing digitally, and the whole thing being done, well, as I said, digitally. And when she received each thing, she was so full of enthusiasm. She sort of, it was like she'd look at every little detail on there and sort of say nice things about it. And it was almost so nice to get her enthusiasm that you almost didn't have to be paid for it. Just praise from Shelley would have done. But
yeah, I know her passion for comics. I love talking to her about everything, like anything to do with comics. And I told her like the first time I chatted with her that she was the first editor I followed. Like I followed writers, I followed artists, but then when I started paying attention to who edited the book, if I saw her name, I'm like, I'll check that out. I was always willing to do it.
Of course, we knew Karen Berger when because we first went to DC in 1979, and I think Karen was the new kid. I think she was Paul Levitz's assistant.
Right.
This is Karen at that time, and then she went on to do Vertigo, didn't she?
Yeah, Vertigo's still my favorite
Yes.
imprint of all time. I love Vertigo. I was so sad when they shut it down.
Yeah, yeah. Is there an
See,
equivalent now?
I mean, I guess they try to say like the DC Black Label. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yes,
But
I've
to
heard
me,
of it.
that's not Vertigo. You know, Vertigo was not just doing DC characters, but
Yeah.
darker or whatever, or more gritty. You know, like
Mm.
Vertigo was its own thing. I think some of my favorite comics of all time came from Vertigo.
Well, I
You
mean,
know,
Sandman gave rise to Sandman, didn't it?
right?
Preacher, all of those.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the old titles like Doom Patrol and um, Animal Man actually were absorbed into
Same thing.
Vertigo.
I think the same thing with Swamp Thing. They eventually absorbed that
Swamp Thing,
into.
yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So like all that stuff when I was a kid and I was like starting to, like I got a little, my reading taste got a little bit more, more mature. I
Yeah.
like Swamp Thing was the first one I read and it had the Vertigo brand.
Yeah.
So then I'm like, oh, what's this? So then I just kept following other stuff in Vertigo and yeah, it was
Yeah.
just such a great time at DC.
I
It's
think one of my favorite reads was Doom Patrol. I loved the original 60s Doom Patrol with
yeah.
because Bruno Premiani and Arnold Drake was the writer in the 60s, and I
Hmm.
thought they were good characters. But then when Grant Morrison took it over, was that the 80s, 90s? I don't know when that
Yeah,
was.
he took over with issue 19 of that particular run.
I love the sort of strange Dada-esque quality,
Yeah.
metaphysical quality of that stuff. So much so that when they did the collected editions, I talked myself into doing the covers of about 5 of them.
Yeah, I know.
Um,
I love the one you did for the omnibus. I love that cover.
Now then, which was the omnibus? What you mean that gigantic? Oh no,
The
that's the
gigantic
invisible.
one. No, yeah, that one. They did like all because I think there's 4 books, like
Yeah.
deluxe books of it. And you have the covers of those too, but then there's the omnibus one
Is
that
this?
it
Are we still on Doom Patrol here? Is this Doom
yeah, it's
Patrol?
still Doom Patrol.
I can't remember what the cover was of that. Anyway, I'll look it up. I'll Google it.
Okay. Um so you talk about doing digitally stuff. Are you still drawing traditionally and then transferring it to digital, or have you moved just
No,
strictly digital?
no, no. Everything from start to finish is digital. I don't do any drawing, penciling or inking or anything. People ask me for commissions, but I'm so unpracticed at doing that sort of thing that I can't do them. The end result would not be fit to be seen, so I always decline. So everything is done in Photoshop. There are a lot of apps for drawing comics, like Manga Studio, which I think is now called something else.
Mhm.
A lot of these things people use, and they also use the Cintiq, which is like a drawing tablet, like a big iPad that you can draw on. But I'm still using the Wacom tablet, which is the thing on the desktop and the pen. Can you
Mhm.
picture this? And the screen is in front of me, and
Okay.
the fact that you can work in layers is very useful because if I want to draw a hand, I can take a photo of my hand and just slide it on one of the layers and draw a hand. And I can do a rough drawing in Photoshop and fade it down to 10 or 12%, so it's just only faintly there, and then do a slightly better one over the top. So everything is digital, which is a great loss for me selling artwork, and
Yeah, I
for
was gonna
people who
say.
and people who want to buy it.
I get it though. I mean, like, take that
Mm.
you don't have to have as many supplies, obviously, when you're
No,
digital. So
well, when Vertigo was the things I was doing, like Animal Man, as they were absorbed into Vertigo, they wanted painted covers. Now I have never been any good at painting, um, I was using acrylic inks and airbrushes and masking out film and all kinds of stuff of that sort and struggling away. My wife, who has only just a few minutes ago left the table to my left over here, used to paint quite large parts of my painted work.
My wife's an artist too. These paintings behind me are
I
all
was going
hers.
to say, I was going to say that. Yes,
Yeah.
my wife is working on a landscape, well, a series of landscapes. I did Tank Girl, some Tank Girl covers for DC, which were some of my favourites, and they were partially painted by her. There were airbrush bits and by me, and inked bits, and then a few bits were painted by her. So we collaborated.
That's awesome. Are you working on anything right now?
At the moment, okay. When I was 13, I used to clip a newspaper strip out of a British newspaper called Carol Day, drawn by a fellow called David Wright.
Mhm.
There were two newspaper strips at that time that I loved. Another one was Jeff Hawke by Sidney Jordan. Sidney is currently 93 years old, and I was on the phone to him recently. But the other one was Carol Day by David Wright. And I think gradually people in the States are beginning to discover this lovely, sumptuous artwork. And there's a second volume of collected, a whole story of Carol Day by David Wright coming out. The first one is shortly coming out, and I'm working on the cover of the second one. So what I'm doing is, I mean, ideally, it would be great if David Wright was doing the cover. So what I've done is I've gone through the strips in this story, and I've found a nice big close-up of Carol and another one of Carol, a full figure, and another one of one of the other. So I've made a kind of collage of bits of that already exist, and I'm now going over his work line for line, so it actually looks as if it's drawn by him. So it's a second volume of. I've got a pile of books over here that are recent, which I could show you. And do you know what? I'm going to, if I can find it, if it's here, I must show you the Actress and the Bishop, because you seem rather. I'm not actually. That's the Actress and the Bishop, and this is the magazine they're in. Yeah.
Okay.
There you go. You'll have to check these guys out, because
just online.
Well, they were online for a while, but then eventually these people, I don't know who the publishers are, but it's they said, can we use it in our issue? And the complete collection is coming out. There it is. That's the cover of the complete collection.
Okay, yeah, I'll definitely be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, check it out. But what have I got on at the moment? Yeah, I've got this Carol Day cover to do, and I've got a cover for a lot of the Fleetway IPC characters going back to the 60s. They're now actually collecting those in volumes. And there's a character called Steel Claw that was drawn by a Spanish guy called Jesus Blasco. And the second volume of that's just come out with my cover on. So I'm doing loads of covers for loads of characters that this is just my one chance to draw this character. Apart from that, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm doing a memoir. I've got, there's a memoir of mine coming out, in a pictorial memoir. It's a memoir in photos, really.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, It's About Time, a memoir in pictures and words by me, and it's 330 pages long, and that's finished. But that's hopefully coming out next year.
And who's publishing it?
It's called The Book Palace.
Okay.
I think Diamond. They've been talking to Diamond about whether they'll be interested in distributing it, but I haven't got an image to show you. But I'm working on the second one.
So that's awesome.
Yeah, it's not drawings. It's mostly not drawings, but it's everything I can remember, where I have some kind of visual evidence to prove it is in there.
I love memoirs, so like I definitely gonna be picking that up. That's awesome.
I think Dave Gibbons, his one is coming out shortly too.
Yeah. I saw that from Dark Horse.
Yes.
Yeah. Definitely gonna pick that up too.
It's going to be a show and tell all about his people, all the rest of us.
Yeah. Well, I just want to, thank you again for taking some time to chat with me. I had a blast talking comics with you, and
Oh,
if you're up for it, I would definitely love to have you back on. Definitely, maybe when that memoir comes out, maybe we can kind of talk about it a little bit and help get the word out for that.
that would be great. And thank you very much. We've talked about a few things that I haven't talked about before, but
Good. Well, I'm glad I could always get. See, I always sometimes when I'm getting ready to interview, I want to watch other interviews, but I feel like for me sometimes then I might repeat questions. Like I might.
yeah,
So like I try not to I try to keep what I'm interested in asking you, because like I already, the minute I'm reaching out to a creator, I know what I want to talk about kind of for the
yeah,
most part, and then I like to let it go natural. If I read or watch something else that they've done with somebody, then it
yeah.
influences me too much. So I'm
Well, I
real.
mean, the thing in my position is it's always, when somebody says, "How did you get started in comics?" Then you find yourself saying exactly the same words that you said the last time and the time before
Right.
that.
Yeah.
But then you sort of move into other kinds of areas. Uh, it's you're less inclined to repeat yourself. But it's kind of difficult for you in a way because you've got to ask these questions, haven't you?
Well, I do, because like I never know if this is somebody's first time either
Uh,
listening or reading to an interview with you. So maybe this is the
yeah,
first time they've seen something. So I like to kind of always get those, lack of a better way of saying it, the generic questions out of the
of course.
way, and then get into the other stuff. So thank you so much for taking
Pleasure.
time, and I look forward to doing this with you again in the future.
Okay.
And for everybody listening and watching, I'm going to drop all the links where they can find you on social media and how they can follow you and stay up to date with everything you're doing. Yeah, thank you again.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.